So what are the strongest and weakest units for our new Codex of Space Dwarves? Who are the mightiest warriors of the leagues, and who come up a bit short? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd go through a tier list of the new leagues of Votann units, and talk about which among these augmented clone dwarves are looking like the strongest choices in the army. Obviously it's a little bit early days now, but after a fair bit of theory crafting with the Codex, these are the units that I think are perhaps the most standout in the book, and I'll explain why as we go along. Overall though, my general take is that it's a codex without that many datasheets, and Games Workshop do seem to have done really quite well to make the vast majority of them tempting and fill their own niche. And I think as it stands, most Votann lists will probably use over half the datasheets in the codex. There are only 12 on offer. Obviously tier lists are a touch arbitrary, and so far the codex hasn't been tested in the rigours of tournaments yet. If I do feel like I've got anything majorly wrong in hindsight, I'll update in a pinned comment down below. In any case though, let's go through the list. I've ranked the units into 3 different tiers, and tier 1 I've split into 2 for units that I think are quite close, but perhaps a few no's ahead of some of the others. So first up, in tier 3, I've chosen to rank only the one unit, and I feel like unfortunately the Brockier Thunderkin are probably the most outclassed unit in the codex, just perhaps not really quite strong enough within their niche. These are basically the heavy weapons dwarves in the exo frames, 35 to 45 points per model, and they choose between an anti-infantry bolt cannon, a close-range grav cannon graviton gun, and a conversion beamer that can potentially skewer multiple units. Their intended role is to basically be something like Devastators or Havocs, slow-moving core infantry packing heavy firepower, but they just don't really do a fat lot else, and it does mean that that firepower does need to be really quite efficient if people are going to use them. All their loadouts kind of have flaws. The bolt cannons are good range and quite general purpose, but seem flat worse than Sagittars armed with the same guns. They're very fast, so can get line of sight better. The graviton cannon just seems annoyingly low range, a threat range of 23 inches even if moving directly towards the enemy isn't spectacular. And the conversion beamer just doesn't seem all that efficient unless you can manage to skewer multiple enemy units with the beams, perhaps a bit dependent on your opponent lining up. It is quite nice that it can be layered with good core buffs from the various characters, but I'm just not sure it's quite enough to carry them against the other gun platforms. Their durability is fairly solid, though not enormously stand out within the codex. 3 wounds of toughness 5, 3 plus save void armor, and I suppose they won't have too much trouble getting light cover to augment that. I do think they're not terrible for their role, and I think they're still usable, particularly with some of the character choices, but they'd perhaps just seem a bit more niche and less standout than any of the other choices out of the book. I feel just for slow-moving heavy weapons, their raw might really has to carry them. Moving on into tier 2, and perhaps in testimony to the Votann seeming quite so well balanced and dangerous across the board, again I've chosen just to rank the single unit in here, which in tier 2 I'd rank as usable, but are perhaps a bit more niche than some of the other choices in the codex. That unit is the Chthonian Berserks, a unit that I think quite a lot of people are looking forward to running, and still does have a place within lists I think, but I feel that while these guys have some great damage output on paper, I do feel that they perhaps have more issues facing them than perhaps any unit barring the Thunderkin. First up, don't get me wrong, their damage output is good, very good in Chronos Hegemony. Either some flat AP -3, damage 3 hammers, or plasma blades that either have a damage 2 or damage 1 profile. In theory, in Chronos you could get 8 attacks at strength 6, AP -3. Pretty ridiculous for a 22-point model, and access to easy damage buffs with their 1 command point to reroll hits, judgment token or not. However though, while their dangerous melee isn't in dispute, I think that they might have some serious issues making melee reliably if the opponent wants to keep them away. They've got a bit of a problem in that they only move 5 inches, can't really go any faster, and are relatively fragile to enemy shooting compared with just about every other unit in the codex. They kind of feel similar to things like Sisters of Battle Repentia. Great damage output on a lightly armoured unit with Feel No Pain, but unlike Repentia, they don't have options for advance and charge, don't have miracle dice to lock in long rolls, and no easy ways to actually add inches to their movement or charges within the codex, besides I think one of the custom leagues that's probably not going to get taken anyway. They do get an innate charge reroll which would help them, but it means that the opponent can be at least fairly safe in the knowledge that if they put their units something like 16 or 17 inches away from them, there's almost no chance of them getting to melee unless you roll a double 6 or something, and when they're just moving forward normally, they might struggle to get from one terrain piece to another, only 5-inch movement base, and only 8 inches if they advance as it's capped at 3. Realistically, I think this makes them a bit more of a countercharge unit than one that you can actually reliably deliver to the enemy's lines, probably going to be lurking within a Sagittor or land fortress, or perhaps just behind terrain somewhere in your deployment zone. and perhaps threatening an objective, so if the opponent puts some units on it, they can jump out and get to work with those plasma blades. I still do think that they remain usable for that role, and I'm sure we will see them in competitive lists. Votann only really have these and the Terminators as battle line melee units, and having a small squad of them hiding within a land fortress certainly could deter people from getting too close to it. Overall, I'd still say they're fine, they have a role. I'd put them in tier 1 if you were playing Chronos Hegemony for all the extra melee threat, but the combination of being fairly slow and also fairly easy to gun down just really isn't a good one in my book. Moving on, we have tier 1, where as you can tell so far I would rank most of the Codex. For a bit more differentiation, I've split it down into a lower end and a higher end, but all of these I think are solid competitive choices we're going to see in a lot of top lists. First up, we have the standard troops of the faction, the Hearthkin Warriors. They seem to be a unit that people are kind of split on at the moment. Some people thinking that they're going to be absolutely amazing, when some people thinking that they're going to be a bit on the weak side. Either way, as the only troops of the faction, they will get used as a result, and I think that they do have rather a lot of advantages going for them. Toughness wise, they're really not too bad. 4+ save infantry with 1 wound for 11 points usually aren't that great, but they can get an easy access 5+ invul from a car, they have the void armor, and they have a nice medic upgrade to tank a shot very cheaply each turn. They can spam out a whole ton of bolter or ion shots for a fair amount of damage at close range. Mass low strength shots or even melee attacks work very nicely with judgment tokens, and for basic scoring troops these guys could really punch above their weight with a bit of support. I think that they're viable both in big 20 block dwarf units, supported by a bunch of characters and stratagems, or potentially broken down into a couple of smaller units to ride in Sagittars. That way allows you to get some small units of these, which could be good for securing objectives out of line of sight. Stratagem wise, they have access to a ridiculous amount of options. Really easy things like just reroll all hits against judgment token units, combined with auto wounds that's awesome. They can also fall back and shoot, heroic intervene, or return fire when they're shot, all of which could be very powerful in the right situation. They do have access to that Magna Rail rifle as well, which is one of the most fearsome weapons in the Codex. A great big anti-tank gun with D3+3 damage, ignoring invuls and the chance for splash damage. It's just not something that you can completely ignore if it's inside one of these squads. For downsides though, they're not a unit without some problems. Mass damage one of any sort will be at least fairly efficient against them just through weight of saves, and in terms of actually delivering their damage, they are rather slow and short ranged. If the opponent desperately wants to avoid 24-inch or 18-inch shooting, then they might well be able to with important units. They do feel like a unit that's again a bit more of a counterpunch type unit than the Berserks, but at least these guys don't have to make combat. Out of the choices within tier 1, I'd probably rank them towards the lower end. I feel like more people will be using these as just the standard troops choices rather than going mad and spamming them, but they've certainly got access to a lot of powerful options and good damage dealers if you do want to support them. Next up are a unit I'd also rank towards the lower end of tier 1, and these are the Einhir Hearthguard. 35 points per model for essentially Votann Exo Armor Terminators. They perhaps seem to be the unit that you want to bully up the centre of the board, take a lot of firepower and dish it out in return. They are at least fairly sturdy with toughness 5, 2 wounds, a 2+ save with void armor, and -1 damage baked in, though at least compared with Terminators that profile does put them at a bit more risk of things like mortal wounds or damage 1 attacks chipping away at them faster than most Terminators would be taken down. Still though, it's far from a bad defensive profile, and it could be good for toughness buffs such as the Fortify spell. Then from shooting and combat, they have fairly equal threat in both phases. In shooting, it's spamming out a bunch of mortal wounds or plasma shots with their main gun, plus a bunch of anti-infantry fire. The mortal wound Volkite looks like it was synergized very well with full rerolls, say from a high Carl. Their melee is maybe a touch underwhelming compared with Terminators. They seem to be a bit more of a balanced unit between shooting and melee, rather than just dominating in combat with a few extra shots at range. I think the Teleport Crest is a rather interesting choice for them. With Votann generally being fairly slow on the board, I think this Teleport Crest is really tempting for these. Jump them up the board turn 1 to get them all over an objective, apply some early pressure with the shooting, and then you'd hopefully have them in a fairly threatening position where they can't just be ignored for a few turns. Beyond that, as the biggest, most dangerous core unit, they're pretty excellent for buffs of just about any sort. Anything that amps up their damage or durability will generally go miles here. For weaknesses, again like the Hearthguard, they're kind of slow and avoidable if they aren't teleporting up the board. Mortal wounds and damage 1 aren't that bad into them, and their melee damage is okay, but perhaps not stand out enough to be beating down the enemy's elites. I think you definitely need to weigh up both the shooting and the combat phase when they're deciding what they're going to be doing each turn. Still though, a very solid looking unit. I feel like they might most likely see play in big blocks of 10 doing an early game teleport. Lastly in this section we have the Sagittor. The Votann light transport with a scary amount of firepower, halfway between a moon rover and a radio-controlled car. These guys are 110 points base depending on what you arm them with, and they feel like one of the units that seems very close to being able to be spammed quite heavily across an army, just because of their speed and damage dealing, even if their durability isn't all that great. In a very slow faction, they move 12 inches and have good general purpose firepower. They're just as happily affected by judgment tokens as anything else, and they feel like perhaps one of the best units where you can zip around and just laser a whole load of damage into a unit that you've covered in the markers. I think it is pretty crazy just how much these guys outshoot, say, a standard Razorback. Bolt cannons with 6 shots at strength 6, AP-2, damage 2. Then I'd go for either even more damage 2 with the Master Auto cannons, some longer range anti-tank with the Sagittor missiles, 2 shots at strength 10, AP3, damage 3, or potentially even go pricey for the high las beam cannon, essentially 2 las cannon shots at 24-inch range, but do have the option of hitting multiple units if you line them up. They've got brutal damage output that seems pretty fine for a gun platform just in itself, never mind whether or not they actually transport anything, and carting some Hearthkin warriors or maybe the berserks towards the objectives seems like a nice added bonus along the way. I think the only thing that's potentially holding them back though is that their toughness is fairly bad in 9th edition 40k. 9 wounds at toughness 7 with a 3+ save is going to go down pretty quickly to just about any anti-tank guns. They need to make sure that they were hitting the enemy first rather than the other way around. Perhaps for the whole mech list you could run them in Irani Surta regulars. That would be toughness 8 Sagittors, which does help a bit on that front I guess. I feel like that does balance them out a bit perhaps. Otherwise they do compete with fast attack slots for those Hernkin Pioneers, another very good and kind of necessary unit for a lot of lists I think. But overall I think the Sagittors look very nice. I think I rank them towards the upper end of this section. I debate between this section and the upper tier 1 section. Moving on though, here we have the higher end of tier 1, perhaps some of the most standout datasheets in the entire codex. They give out massive buffs, have massive damage output and toughness, or amazing utility towards winning the mission. Starting off and perhaps most notably, I've just chosen to rank literally all of the Votann characters here. I think that they're all absolutely awesome for the cost, and it's going to be a pretty tricky decision for some lists to decide which one that they're choosing between. I pretty much always expect for Leagues of Votann lists to have just about every one of their HQ slots full. Particularly with Warlord traits and relics or the upgraded version of them, I think every single one of these can be massively stand out for its points and be a big asset to a list. First up and starting out strong we have the Carl, the cheapest HQ at just 70 points base, has a pretty similar stat line to a Space Marine Captain with some decent enough melee profile with a damage 2 weapon included at base, but then rather than just bringing the reroll ones to hit, which he does have, he also has 2 incredibly powerful boosts as well. He doles out a judgment token to one enemy unit, and he can also provide an aura of a 5+ invul save to infantry and bikes. It's just insane value for a 70-point model. The hit rerolls are good, but the judgment tokens are perhaps the most powerful mechanic in the codex, so I think you're usually going to want one of these, and an aura of invuls goes a long way to helping out the bikes, Hearthkin, and maybe the berserks. You don't really want to put this guy side by side to a standard Space Marine Captain. Basically 2 extra buffs and scary melee gear included at base. The Space Marine Captain has to upgrade for this kind of war gear. He can be made even more scarily fighty with adding in some relics such as that flare axe or perhaps the 4 damage Hearth Fist. Then on top of that the High Carl seems like a pretty decent upgrade if you want it. He gives out 4 rerolls to a core unit, which again is amazing with judgment tokens, gives you more chance at those auto wounds, and then he's got a warlord trait that allows him to use his grim efficiency rule twice to hand out yet another token. A very good model, spectacularly efficient for 70 points, and the chapter master style version of him is very nice as well. As an alternative for the High Carl, if you're playing Great Etherean League, you also have the option of Uthar the Destined. I'd see him as a 30-point upgrade to a High Carl, and for those extra 30 points, I think you get a whole load of value once more. First up, just on his base stats, he's a bit fightier, an extra attack and an extra wound with a relic plasma sword, and is just massively tougher because rather than taking multi-damage attacks, he makes all attacks go to damage 1 against him. You're going to need to deal 6 individual wounds to him, be they damage 1, mortal wounds, or damage d6. He also gets 2 warlord traits. He does get the extra judgment token one, which is very nice, but he also has bigger auras to make his reroll ones go further. And then on top of that, within the 30 points, he also has the excellent ancestral fortune ability. He gets to flip 1 dice to a 6 after rolling for any unit within 6 inches. He does it once per battle round. It can be a way to basically auto pass a save on a lot of units, pretty much saving the life of a Votann then and there. but perhaps the absolute insane value that it has is on the Land Fortress's rail cannon. The auto 6 will mean that it should auto wound with a judgment token, and when it auto wounds with a judgment token, it triggers its splash damage special rule, vaporizing a chunk of a squad then and there. Hideously scary. I feel like most armies of the Great Arthurian League will usually be running him, and it seems like it's a strong league in the first place. Next up on our list of Votann HQs that does far more than I'd expect is the Brockier Ironmaster, just 80 points for this guy, and as he goes I think his unit stat line is okay. He is a character unit so can't be directly targeted, has a fair few ablative wounds in those cogs and the assistant, and actually does an okay amount of damage output between all the little weapons, plus a graviton hammer and gun. The reason that you'd want to run this guy though is to make land fortresses massively more survivable and a fair bit more dangerous as well. I think I'd be most tempted to run this guy as the Forge Master upgrade for the extra 25 points. Between all the buffs that you can get between that and one Warlord trait, you could have a land fortress hitting on +1 to hit, no bad thing for a massive vehicle with scary guns. He gets to heal 4 wounds automatically per turn. That's usually going to be something like 56 points worth of land fortress returned to the table each time he does that. He gets a crazily powerful ability to negate 1 failed save per battle round for a unit nearby. That means that say if the land fortress gets hit by a melter shot, you're about to take d6 plus 2 damage, you can just then turn it off and make it damage 0. Again, potentially that could save you another 5 wounds worth of land fortress that would have got killed on a very tough platform. Finally, as if all those bits weren't enough, in that upgraded wargear type form, he also gets an option for discounting 1 wargear stratagem when used nearby each turn. Say for example, if you were setting up a first turn deep strike with the Ironhair Hearthguard, you could have them do that for just 1 CP rather than 2, and potentially save some other CP over the course of the game if he does happen to be within range of other units using the powerful wargear stratagems. Finally, as if we didn't have enough good things for him, his gun against the right target can put out a scary amount of mortal wounds. 6s to wounds get translated to mortal wounds. With judgment tokens, you might rack up a fair amount of 6s to wound. Say if he did manage to shoot against a unit that had 3 judgment tokens, that'd be an average of 4 or 5 mortal wounds per round of shooting, provided the target had a 3+ save. Basically, I think if you're using land fortresses, this guy is an absolute auto-include, amps them up in so many different ways, and even gives you a bit of a shooty and fighty assassin lurking within the ranks as well. There's no let up for the good value HQs though, as next we have the Grimnir, 80 points for a 2-cast Psyker, with his 2 attendant robot bird friends. Again, I think it's rarely going to be a bad idea in just about any list, as he's got a very cheap cast spell that can farm out 1 command point per turn, and for some reason it's not even bound by the normal regeneration restrictions, so you could stack this with the Great Arthurian League Warlord trait and have a mad amount of CP to spend all game long. With the power of those Votann stratagems, I think that alone could easily justify his existence. Plus he's pretty much the only source of psychic defense within the list, being able to deny a power, and he will get another cast of some sort. I think maybe the most easily usable is Fortify, giving you a bit more defense to something like some Hearthkin Warriors or the Exo-Armored Terminators. +1 toughness and a 6+ feel no pain will make them more annoying to remove from the board. Besides that, he also has a small leadership benefit, which could actually be handy enough with the Hearthguard and the Hearthkin Warriors advancing up. Has a little bit of shooting from the Corvs and a tiny bit of melee with his staff, but maybe nothing to write home about, and you could potentially upgrade him to a Lord Grimnir for 25 points. That nets him another cast, so he could throw out some more mortal wounds via smite, or he could take his staff option for the full choice of the entire Skinwrought discipline. He has got a power to turn off invul saves for a unit that could be potentially quite powerful in combination with other damage dealers. Again, seems crazily efficient, just farming out command points each turn and making a unit tougher seems easily enough. Never mind the helpful psychic denial, and maybe being able to flex to smite and damage dealing if it makes more sense. Finally, for these massively efficient Votann characters, we get to the Ironhair Champion, around 90 to 100 points per model. In theory, this guy doesn't do anything quite as vital for the whole structure of the army. Perhaps in other armies the various champion datasheets tend to be a bit overlooked, but I think Games Workshop has made him tempting enough just by the fact that he has absolutely so much might both in terms of damage and defense for his cost. He hits like an absolute truck, he's decently tough with it, and he does actually have a surprising amount of other bonuses too. Starting out with his raw combat, he normally gets 4 attacks with a damage d3 plus 3 hammer, always a great start, and I think that a lot of people are going to be tempted to take Exactor, the relic version of that, where 6s to hit cause d3 plus 3 mortal wounds. I think the best idea with that would be to try and get a source of 4 rerolls on him, either a 1 CP with a judgment token, a high Carl, or a warlord trait. Then even with mortal wounds alone, just fish for those 6s, it's averaging 6 mortal wounds average per fight phase. If you do get lucky and roll 2 6s after those rerolls, then that's 10 mortal wounds on some Terminators for example. You could take out half a squad that way. He's going to be even more dangerous in Cronus Hegemony, and I think that his more cheaper Axe build could also be interesting as well, maybe in the Immo Conglomerates. They've got a trait for +1 damage, which could be quite good when farmed out over double the attacks. In general though, throughout any league, he's going to love just about anything that amps up his toughness or damage, both of which are great already. Speaking of which though, besides raw melee damage, he is decently tough. T5 and a 2+ save with void armor. He gets -1 damage for his exosuit, and also -1 to wound in melee, making him staggeringly hard to kill there. I think I'd usually want to take him with a shield crest for 6 wounds and a 4+ invul as well. Even more solid and resistant to high AP attacks. Besides that, he's got a bit of shooting with his combi bolter. She'll whittle down an infantry model or two as he charges in. He grants a reroll once to wound aura for Einhir nearby. Makes him good to run alongside a squad of those. He has the option of being accelerated for a 1 CP 17-inch movement. He won't be able to charge after that, but he could get in a very problematic place where the opponent might struggle to deal with him, then he can charge next turn. And finally, just in case he needed more melee damage, he's got the option for D3 mortal wound impact hits if he can roll higher than the enemy's toughness. Basically this guy, along with the Chthonian Berserks, are the two scariest melee threats in the Votann army. With this chap though, you can shield him behind other units and have him jump out. Plus it's crazily tanky for a character of this points cost. I genuinely think that there's a crazy amount of competition for the HQ slots in the Votann army. It's going to be more a question of what you choose to pass up, as I feel like a fair few lists might run all 4 of the character variants if HQ slots were convenient. Moving on though, we have the Hexton Land Fortress, 230 points base, and one of the biggest, baddest and most dangerous units in the whole book, and actually one with just an objectively good defensive profile. 16 wounds at toughness 8, a 2+ save with void armor. Certain leagues can make him even tougher, and there's likely to be one of those Brockhere Iron Masters nearby to negate the very nastiest hits that he takes each turn, and then pile a whole load of wounds back on him after he's taken damage. I'd say this Land Fortress, if anything, is the unit that's likely to be taking the hits and dealing out massive pain in return. The base loadout has 14 mid-strength AP -2 damage 2 hits, going to be pretty effective against most things with judgment tokens, and then you back that up with a devastating main weapon, most likely the very scary railgun. The one that ignores invul saves with an average of 10 damage, and if you do manage to land a judgment token auto wound on them, then the damage spills over, you get 10 wounds on any squad, so potentially killing 10 infantry or 5 standard space marines. A pretty efficient anti-everything gun in 40k, which is terrifying to have in the arsenal, particularly on such a durable platform that's dangerous in other ways. As mentioned, Mr. Uthar can make that even more reliable, basically guaranteeing the auto wounds, in a combo that I do wonder whether was really intended. Then this thing has surprising stratagem access as well. One judgment token can give you a 1 CP reroll all hits. Again, enormously powerful if you are getting auto wounds on some of those hits. There's also a 1 command point to fight on full profile if it's damaged as well. And late game could even use that 12-inch advance rule to give up its firepower and make a late game objective dash, so could perhaps even be handy for scoring points later on. Some leagues can add even more to that already mighty defensive profile as well. It casually gets toughness 9 in Urani Surta. That's going to mess with a whole load of high damage weapons such as Melter, and the Ymir Conglomerate can get a 4+ invul save on it too, again helping ward off the highest damage weapons around, anything with AP -4. Finally, as mentioned previously, it does have transport capacity, and because it looks like it easily justifies itself just on its own points cost, it does look like it's a solid option for having Berserks or Hearthkin hide inside, either as a countercharge deterrent for the enemy getting too close, or just for an OBSEC unit to pile out onto objectives as it moves up with its fairly decent 10-inch move. With all the massive power that it has, it does seem like it could be one of the single strongest vehicles in all of 40k, and it feels like it's got a very good chance of just outcompeting anything on the other side of the table in terms of a raw firefight. I guess probably its biggest weakness is combat. It doesn't want to get locked up and have all that damage output forced to target something, though even then I think most units might have a reasonable chance of being wiped out by the small arms and still allowing that railgun to then fire on at something different. I feel like there's at least a reasonable chance that this unit might get toned down in the future. Finally, last but by no means least, we have the Hernkin Pioneers, the unit of Votann jet trikes, which I'll admit I was initially a little bit underwhelmed at the stat line of these guys, but in reality with the other units in the Votann list, I feel like just about every single army will probably include a unit or two of these guys, just for utility purposes and helping win the mission. Aside from characters, they are the cheapest unit in the Codex at 90 points, so aren't too bad as a sacrificial lamb if you need one. But with the rules and options they just have a crazy amount of utility. First up, their damage output I'd rate as okay, 3 autocannon shots per bike, plus a couple of shotguns up close, and maybe 10 points for a rotary cannon to spam some more mid-strength shots downrange. I think their damage isn't bad, but maybe not absolutely standout. I think it's more the advantage that they can basically apply it where they want to with their good movement. Their toughness, I'd say, is just a little bit on the weak side. 3 wounds at toughness 5 and a 4+ save isn't awful. Void armor won't help, but ideally if they can stay hidden while picking off isolated targets then so much the better, though admittedly their big bases might not help them to hide so much. I think what's great about them though is basically OBSEC on a fast moving jet bike with fly, something that's really quite uncommon in 40k in general, and perhaps doubly helpful for the leagues of Votann, who generally have their units move quite slow. What's more, not only are they fast moving, but they also get a pre-game move. That means that they could be on objectives before the game's even started, potentially stop opponents even from being able to take them if they can stay hidden, or maybe even get to work on certain early game actions. That pre-game move has plenty of other potential as well. It could just keep them safe from enemy guns if they happen not to be going first, or if you are going first, then that could set you up for the perfect alpha strike, zoom them up the board, and you could put yourself in the perfect place to shoot the enemy down with a whole bunch of autocannon, shotgun, and rotary cannon shots. And while their combat profile isn't exactly great, it could still be worth following up for a nuisance charge on certain enemy units, locking up powerful infantry with big guns, or even just getting in a position where they can move block big units of the enemy from moving up. 100 points worth of unit could easily be worth sacrificing if it keeps something like 500 points of enemies out of the game for one more turn. If you do want to trade out their damage output completely for a turn, you can spend 1 CP for a big 12-inch advance. That will have them moving 24 inches, which is pretty mad on an OBSEC unit. If there's an isolated objective with somewhere to hide on it, then that will be really nice to get on that, and hopefully sit safe for a turn or two. Finally, the squad can take some other upgrades as well, maybe ignore cover if you want it, but I feel like that searchlight's quite an interesting choice as well. For 1 CP, it allows you to throw out another judgment token. Combine that with a Carl and another effect of some sort, and it seems like one of the most reliable ways to get a unit all the way up to 3 and ready for easy deletion. Overall, I will admit that their damage and defensive stats are just a bit so-so, not massively standout, but it's the crazy amount of utility that they have that makes them a near auto-include in most lists, I think. Fast-moving jet bikes with OBSEC in an otherwise very slow army. So I think that just about brings us to the end of our look through the Votann Codex. Let me know what you think of the rankings and the justifications, and are there any that you agree with or disagree with, and why? Looking forward to making a bunch more Space Dwarf videos over the next few days and weeks. Should be fun to talk about a few more of the units in a bit more detail, and I'll look forward to reviewing some tournament lists once we no doubt get them. In any case, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see any of that. I do try and keep the 40k content coming just about every day. Finally, if you have been finding videos like this useful on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description. The channel's Patreon is what allows me to keep these videos coming as regularly as I do, and make making 40k content my main thing. If you have been enjoying a lot, and you would like to help the videos keep on coming, check out the link below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, then feel free to check it out. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.